States and stages. Is spirituality only a model? Only a concept? Hello, this is Chris speaking, Shores of Infinity, with a video about spirituality and enlightenment. This time about states and stages. What is the difference between states and stages, and why is this interesting? Stages is something that comes from Western psychology. Western psychologists like Erikson and Piaget, they came up with developmental stages of children and maybe also adults. Same with Freud or Clare Graves, although he mostly looked at societies and a little bit less at individuals. Those are stages. One stage follows upon the next, and each previous stage is a prerequisite to reach the next stage. So it's about adulthood. Real human adulthood. You have to go through these childhood stages and then again through these adult stages to really arrive at actual real human adulthood. If you get stuck in any stage, you will get stuck in some psychological loop and then be held back by that topic, by this issue. Now, this is a matter of psychology and therefore also of personality. The personality definitely goes through stages of development. But is that true also for spirituality? In spirituality, what we describe, or what the ancient mystics and ancient Indian seers described, are mostly states, not stages. A state is something you can get into by practices like prayer, meditation, or fasting, and so on, or drugs, but they're not permanent. As UG said, we are not made, for example, to experience happiness permanently. Our nervous system can't cope with it. So just as we go through states of grief or happiness or anger, we also can experience states of higher consciousness, of unity with the divine, or feeling as if you were the divine, of knowing everything, of bliss, and so on. Those are states that can be reached by practices or can just happen by themselves without apparent cause. Because also, as you realize in these states, there is no cause and effect, and there is no time once you're there. But you usually cannot maintain these states. They come and go. Now, and there's a big mix-up between states and stages, because especially Westerners, Europeans, Americans, Australians, and so on, when we hear about states of consciousness, we tend to think in stages of development. So we think, okay, once I have reached a certain state equals stage, then I will always be there, that there's no way back. There's a linear or exponential upwards curve, and if I have a certain experience, then this means I have permanently reached a certain stage of spiritual development. This is a very dangerous assumption because it mostly leads to spiritual bypassing, because you assume that you are further along the way than you actually are. But this leads us to the question, is there a way? Is there a path at all? Or are they only just states? States you experience in the moment, and that's it. There is no spirituality. It's only a model, it's only a concept. Or is there? Someone like UG Krishnamurti would say, no, there is no spirituality. There are only states, no stages. But we have already talked on this channel about models of stages like spiral dynamics and Jeffrey Martin's Finders Locations and David Hawkins' scale of consciousness from 0 to 1000. So spiral dynamics is definitely something that we could describe as stages of development of society or the individual, similar to Freud and Piaget and Erikson. While the locations and David Hawkins' scales, they could just as well just describe states. In their description, there's nothing that supposes or defines that one location or one number must necessarily follow after another. So the experience of full enlightenment in David Hawkins' terms is 700 plus. So you could be in a state of 700 plus, but not necessarily in a permanent stage of 700 plus. Same in Jeffrey Martin's locations. If we are, for example, right now in location 14, it could be a state of consciousness that comes or came and goes, will go at some point after hours or days or weeks or months, but not necessarily in a permanent stage of location 14. Well, in spiral dynamics, we assume that if you're centered in, let's say, teal, spiral dynamics teal, which is also called violet by Ken Wilber, then we think that you are spending most of your time being centered in the topics of this color, of this stage. So in spiral dynamics, we usually don't distinguish between stages and states. They are the same. So there are spiritual teachers, there are gurus who say there are only stages, or stages and states are the same, and there are some that say no, there are only states, there are no stages. Stages are something of personality development but have nothing to do with spirituality, with enlightenment. My impression is that there are both. There is both. Mostly it's states. You wander in and out of states, or states happen to you, or states just happen to no one in particular. They just happen. Not to a person, but to your soul. So states happen, and afterwards you relate these states to yourself and think that they happen to you as a person. I usually call these peak experiences. I would call them experiences rather than states, but states is just as fine. And at the same time, parallelly, there are also stages, but these stages, it's not a linear upwards thing. You can go up and down. You can be 1 day or 1 week or 1 year in one stage and another time in the next, but this doesn't necessarily have to be a higher stage. It can just as well be a lower stage, especially in times of stress. If you're surprised by something horrible, for example, or if you're overworked, or a beloved one died, something like this, that can pull you down into a lower stage, which is like an area. I would say that stages are more like areas, like countries, for example. Like the world is spirituality. Stages are like different countries where you're most of the time located. And within these countries, there are landmarks like cities and mountains and so on. And these are states. So in general, you can be in a certain stage of personality development, in stage of spiritual development, and or necessarily both. You will be, your personality will be in a certain stage, and your soul will be in a certain stage. They will not be the same. And on top of that, there are states that you can experience that might be totally, completely somewhere else on the map. And this is what it is. It's a map. It's a map. It's easier for us to live in a world where things can be explained. If we hadn't the need to explain stuff, we wouldn't need any models and concepts of stages and states. We just experience it and say, yeah, whoa, that was cool. Or, oof, oh, that was ghastly. Never want to experience that again. So what we can say with certainty is that there are experiences. And that there seems to be someone, like you or me, who experiences those experiences. It seems to happen to someone. And to explain this, to make it somehow bearable, we come up with concepts of stages and states, or both. But in actual fact, they're just experiences. And we don't know if those happen in a linear time frame. Probably not. Also, there seems to be a correlation to the body. The healthier the body, the better. And while the brain is definitely not the source of consciousness, it can influence consciousness in a positive or negative way. So, for example, if you're suffering from Alzheimer's, that will not be conducive to higher states of consciousness. Or maybe to higher states, but definitely not higher stages, because you cannot keep it up. The interesting thing about David Hawkins' calibrations is that once you learn that, you calibrate famous gurus at different times and you come up with different values on the Hawkins scale. At least that's what happens when I calibrate them. And I have lots of experience with calibrating. So it's interesting that I sometimes come up with different values. And this probably means that it's more about states than about stages. People are in a certain stage for some time and then they fall out of it again. There are also states, experiences, peak experiences, in which all this state and stages stuff doesn't make any sense anymore. It's just gobbledygook. Then all spirituality is meaningless. All spiritual pursuit, searching for enlightenment, seems to be total nonsense. Because these experiences happen to you no matter what you do. Because we think in causal terms, we think, okay, it happened to me because I meditated, for example. But that is an assumption. We don't know if it happened because of the meditation. Oopsie, the video is already much too long already, 14 minutes. That was not my intention. So we can think in terms of states and stages, or we can just leave it. It has no objective value. It's just we like to understand things and to categorize things, but there's no objective absolute value to these models. Moreover, these models often lead to some kind of new egoism of ascribing to oneself a certain spiritual development stage that is higher than others, and thus creates again a feeling of separation and a feeling of being better than others, which is called spiritual bypassing, or spiritual materialism. Has nothing to do with consciousness or enlightenment. There are rumors of people who were able to, or who are able to stay in these higher states and stages of consciousness, like the founders of religions like the Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, or the Babaji avatar. But we don't know. They're just stories, they're rumors. Unless you have met one of them and talked to them, there's no point in believing them. There's only a point in believing what you yourself have experienced or what happened in your presence. So to finish here for today, what can we learn from this? What's the message here? The message is, don't pause your life to reach a higher state or stage of consciousness. It's a parallel thing. It's not that you should stop living a life and only pursue higher states of consciousness, because this is or can become an addiction, just as you can lust after stages of inebriation, of drug haze, or be addicted to feelings of happiness by games or sex or watching movies or whatever. You can also become addicted to higher states of consciousness. And definitely you can become addicted to drugs who tend to induce this. But then what? The underlying assumption of chasing after these states is that the states are stages. That once you reach a certain state, it will become a stage after a while. And this is only an assumption. This is not grounded in the experience of most enlightened people. Material life will stay material life. You still have to get along somehow in your material life with food, family, work, money, and so on. It's not the case that once you reach full enlightenment at Hawkins scale 700, then all your material worries are suddenly gone. I mean, the worries are gone, but the issues are not gone. You will not worry about it anymore, but you will still have to earn money and find a roof to sleep under and stay warm and eat something and so on. You will still have to chop wood and carry water, as they say. This will never stop, no matter in which state or stage you are centered in currently. I know so many people who say they're leading a spiritual life, and what they mean is they don't have a job and they don't have a house, a flat either. They just live somewhere with friends or so. But that's not the definition of a spiritual life. You have to get your material life under control somehow anyway, or nevertheless. And because of that, I even know quite a few people who say, then fuck it. If there's no benefit for material life in this, then screw it. I leave this path and pursue the material life from now on, the material chain of gain. Both viewpoints are a little extreme. It's not necessary to only choose the life of a monk or only choose the life of a banker. You can do both. And now and then higher states of consciousness will happen. And you or something will be there to observe it, to experience it. And maybe this will cause a higher stage of consciousness. And maybe not. But who cares? That's a great question here. Who cares? Who cares in you if you are centered in a so-called higher stage of consciousness? Who cares about that? Thank you to all my Patreons. Thank you for joining me as a Patreon. Thank you for liking and subscribing. It helps others find this channel. And see you soon.